a podcast. The link's in the show notes. The podcast is an interview with somebody who worked on Llama 3, so part of the Facebook AI team. And the conversation was about the training and sort of the intricacies of the training. Interesting conversation, particularly for people who are working on actually training large language models. So questions of tokenization, questions of scaling, and questions of fine-tuning that came up. And I want to talk about that latter one in particular because it sort of brings up the question of imitation learning versus reinforcement learning with human feedback. I want to focus on that in this particular episode. And the reason is the following. There is obviously the question of how to best come up with a reward function in a model. So if you have for example, a full self-drive, Tesla full self-drive, how do you actually decide what is good driving? And you can do that by imitation learning. You just imitate how people drive. Or you could potentially also do some reinforcement with human feedback. And since we don't know exactly what Tesla is doing, we're kind of guessing. And my guess is that they're probably doing both. And what's really interesting about this conversation, which kind of stuck in my head, is the idea that it's relatively hard to describe what is good driving in order, like even if I had to drive myself and always be a good driver, I think it's just a little bit difficult. I mean, you can do it, but it's much easier to decide what is better driving, A or B. So humans are really good at deciding between two complex options, which one's better. But it's relatively hard to create those options. This is not even a podcast. It's July 31st, 2024. This is Krim Delco. For the year, we are up 5.4%. The market is up 14.2%. We're underperforming by 8.8%. So reinforcement learning by human feedback versus imitation learning. Let's focus on that. And what's really interesting here is that you have this idea. If neural nets are universal function approximators, that means they can approximate some really complex structure of real life. Then evaluating those outcomes is relatively easy for humans. We can decide whether option A or B is a better option. So in the case of Llama 3, when it comes up with a poem or a haiku, we can decide whether haiku A is better than haiku B. So if I want Llama 3 to generate a poem in Shakespeare style about a sunset in California, I can decide which one's better relatively well. I can decide which one's better, much better than if I had to do it myself. If I had to imitate, if I had to actually write the poem and teach the model how to write a poem. Now let's talk about robotics. Let's talk about self-driving, right? So let's take a scenario where we train a model of how to drive. Let's say we have FSD, which is training based on imitation learning, end-to-end. And now we want to fine-tune. So in the fine-tuning case, we can tell the model whether, let's say in a scenario where there's something on the road, it approaches this obstacle and then stops and then waits and then goes around, or it goes straight without stopping. We can decide that maybe option 1 is better than option 2. So we can decide that. We might have trouble doing always the right thing, but what we can do really well is decide which option is better. And this kind of reminds me of the NP and NP problem set type of conversation in theoretical computer science. like NP complete and stuff like that, where we have certain problems, like for example, factorizations of numbers that are really hard to do, but very easy to evaluate. And reinforcement learning with human feedback actually reminds me of that. So it's hard to do stuff, but easy to evaluate. So whenever we have a situation like that, we might actually want to use reinforcement learning with human feedback. And that's really sort of the case for it, and brings about the large interest that comes from the community. Reinforcement learning human feedback actually grew out of the alignment community. Fred Lambert, one of the proponents of this whole, he's with the Allen Institute now. The alignment community, in my opinion, unfortunately politically very biased, and there's a lot of issues with that. But fundamentally, the question in the alignment community is, okay, how can we build models that are aligned with what we want them to achieve? And that per se is a good thing, as long as we know what we want to achieve. But assuming we know what we want to achieve. So in the case of self-driving, alignment is actually, in my opinion, much easier to define. Like we have a good sense for what we want to achieve, but we might not be able to explicitly formulate it. And therefore, we have reinforcement learning human feedback on top of the imitation learning, so we can actually fine-tune the models and have scenarios offered to us based on the imitation learning, and then decide amongst them which one is better. So to summarize, reinforcement learning human feedback really gives us the opportunity to decide between very complex options that we might not be able to generate ourselves. So for example, in driving, it's difficult to drive optimal. Like it's hard, even for a seasoned driver, it's hard to always do the right thing. So what you could have is a model which is trained on imitation learning. So it's trained on a sort of an average Gaussian outcome of driving scenarios, but then you could still fine tune it, because it's relatively easy for human evaluators to say, well, this way is better than that way. And that goes to a lot of complex decision making, Netflix movie recommendations, right? It's very, very complex to define what is a movie that I like. That's a complex question. I mean, yes, we can answer it a little bit. I like this, I like that. But in the end, why do I like Goodfellas? Why do I like The Godfather? What is it that I'm fascinated about? It's hard to say, but I can tell that I prefer Goodfellas to The Irishman. Definitely, I can tell, I like this better than that. Hard to explain why, but it's very easy to decide A or B. Which brings up another research question, obviously. Should we have just binary decisions? Should we have 4, A, B, C, D, 10? That's beyond this episode. It's just worth thinking about. Okay, how should we make those decisions? Should we make them in a sort of a binary tree? I think binary tree is a good approximation of how we like to make decisions. A lot of our models, Monte Carlo models, things like that, are based on binary trees. So binary, because it's easy, it reduces the complexity, and then we can increase the complexity by having a tree. So again, what we're doing here is really trying to fine-tune the model. What does fine-tuning mean? We're trying to reduce the complexity and give us better, more efficient trajectories for inference. That's really what fine-tuning means, right? The reason we're fine-tuning a model is so when we do inference, we don't have to go through a gigantic search space. We can reduce the search space, and the way we can reduce the search space is by having humans make decisions on, okay, A is better than B, and therefore reduce the trajectory towards more tractable solutions. Thank you.